everyone, welcome back to Read Along Saturday. Today we are continuing with The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, chapter number 19, that one should avoid being despised and hated. Now, concerning the characteristics of which mentioned is made above, I have already spoken about many of them, and the others I wish to discuss very briefly, and that the prince must consider, as has been in part said before, how to avoid those things which will make him hated. And as often as he shall have succeeded, he will have fulfilled his part, and he need not fear any danger in other reproaches. It makes him hated above all things, as I have said, to be rapacious and to be the violator of the property women of his subjects, from both of which he must abstain. And when neither the property nor the honor is touched, the majority of men live content, and he has only to contend with the ambition of a few, whom he can curb with ease in many ways. It makes him hated to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean spirited, irresolute, from all of which a prince should guard himself as from a rock, and he should endeavor to show that his actions are of greatness, courage, gravity, and fortitude, and in his private dealings with his subjects, let him show that his judgments are irrevocable, and maintain himself in such a reputation that no one can hope either to deceive him or to get around him. The prince is highly esteemed who conveys this impression of himself. He who is highly esteemed is not easily conspired against, for provided it is well known that he is an excellent man and revered by his people, he can only be attacked with difficulty. For this reason, a prince ought to have two fears, one within, on account of his subjects, the other from without, on account of external powers. For the latter, he is defended by being well armed and having good allies, and if he is well armed, he will have good friends, and affairs will always remain quiet when they are quiet without, unless they should have been already disturbed by conspiracy. And even should affairs outside be disturbed, if he has carried out his preparations and has lived as I have said, as long as he does not despair, he will resist every attack, as I said, Nabis the Spartan did. But concerning his subjects, when affairs outside are disturbed, he has only to fear that they will conspire secretly, from which a prince can easily secure himself by avoiding being hated and despised, and by keeping the people satisfied with him, which is it most necessary for him to accomplish, as I said above at length, and one of the most efficacious remedies that a prince can have against conspiracies is not to be hated, despised by the people, for he can conspires against the prince always expects to please them by his removal. But when the conspirator can only look forward to offending them, he will not have the courage to take such a course, for the difficulties that confront a conspirator are infinite. And as experience shows, many of these conspiracies, but few have been successful, because he who conspires cannot act alone, nor can he take companion except for those who he believes to be malcontents. And as soon as you have opened your mind to malcontent, you have given him the material with which to content himself. For by denouncing you, he can look for every advantage, so that seeing the gain from his course be assured. And seeing the others doubtful and full of danger, he must be very rare friend, or a thoroughly obstinate enemy, for the prince to keep faith with you. And to reduce the matter into a small compass, I say that on the other side of the conspirator there is nothing but fear, jealousy, prospect of punishment to terrify him, but on the side of the prince there is majesty of principality, the laws, the protection of friends, and the state to defend him, so that adding to all these things popular goodwill, it is impossible that one should be so rash as to conspire. For whereas, in general, the conspirator has to fear before the execution of his plot, in this case he has also to fear the sequel of the crime, because on account of it he has people for an enemy, and thus cannot hope for an escape. Endless example could be given on this subject, but I will content with one brought to pass within the memory of our fathers, Messer Annibale Bentivogli, who was a prince in Bologna, grandfather of present Annibale, having been murdered by Canesci, who had conspired against him. Not one of his family survived, but Messer Giovanni, who was in childhood. Immediately after his assassination, the people rose and murdered all the Casineci. This sprung from the popular goodwill which the house of Bentivogli enjoyed in those days in Bologna, which was so great that although none remained there after the death of Hannibal, who was able to rule the state, and the Bolognese, having information that there was one Bentivogli family in Florence, who up to that time had considered the son of blacksmith, sent to Florence for him and gave him the government of their city, and it was ruled by him until Messer Giovanni came in due course to the government. For this reason, I consider that the prince ought to reckon conspiracies for little account when his people hold him in esteem, but when it is hostile to him and bears hatred towards him, he ought to fear everything and everybody. And well ordered states and well wise princes have taken every care not to drive the nobles to desperation and to keep the people satisfied and contented, for this is one of the most important objects a prince can have. Among the best ordered and governed kingdoms of our times is France, and in it are found many good institutions on which depend the liberty and security of the king. Of these, the first is the parliament and its authority, because he who founded the kingdom, knowing the ambition of the nobility and the boldness, considered that a bit of their mouths would be necessary to hold them in. And on the other side, knowing the hatred of the people, founded in fear against the nobles, he wished to protect them, yet he was not anxious for this to be particular care of the king. Therefore, to take away the reproach which he would be liable to from the nobles for favoring the people and from the people for favoring the nobles, he set an arbiter who should be one of the best to be down and great and favor lesser the without reproach of the king. Neither can you have a better or a more prudent arrangement or a greater source of insecurity for the king and the kingdom. For this, one can draw another important conclusion. The princes ought to leave affairs of reproach to the management of others and keep those of grace in their hands. And further, I consider the prince ought to cherish the nobles, but not so as to make himself hated by the people. It may appear, perhaps, to some who have examined the lives and deaths of Roman emperors that many of them would be an example, contrary to my opinion, seeing that some of them lived nobly and showed great qualities of soul. Nevertheless, they have lost the empire and have been killed by subjects who have conspired against them. Wishing, therefore, to answer these objections, I will recall the characters of some emperors and will show that the causes of their ruin were not different to those alleged by me. At the same time, I will only submit to consideration those things that are noteworthy to him who studies the affairs of those times. It seems to me sufficient to take all those emperors who succeed to the empire, from the Marcus and the philosopher down to Maximus, and there were Marcus and his sons Commodus, Pertinax, Julian, Severus, and his son Antinomius, Caracalla, Macrinus, Heliogabalus, Alexander, and Maximinus. There is first to note that whereas in other principalities the ambition of the nobles and the insolence of the people only have to contented with them, the Roman empires had a third difficulty in having to put up with the cruelty and avarice of their soldiers, a matter so beset with difficulties that it would ruin of many. For it was a hard thing to give satisfaction both to soldier and people, because the people loved peace, and for this reason they loved the unaspiring prince, whilst the soldiers loved the warlike prince who were bold, cruel, and rapacious, which qualities they were quite willing he should exercise upon the people, so they could get double pay and give vent to their own greed and cruelty. Hence it arose that those emperors were always overthrown who either by birth or training had no authority, and most of them, especially those who came anew to principality, recognizing the difficulty of two opposing humors, were inclined to give satisfaction to the soldiers, caring less and less about injuring the people. Therefore, those emperors who through inexperience had need of special favor adhered more readily to the soldiers than to the people, a course which turned out advantageous to them or not, according as the prince knew how to maintain authority over them. From these causes it arose that Marcus, Pertinax, and Alexander, being all men of modest life, lovers of justice, enemies of cruelty, humane and benignant, came to a sad end except Marcus. He alone lived and died honored, because he had succeeded to the throne by hereditary title and owed nothing either to the soldiers or to the people, and afterwards, being possessed by many virtues which made him respected, he always kept both orders in their places whilst he lived, and was neither hated nor despised. But Patronax was created emperor against the wishes of the soldier, who, being accustomed to live licentiously under Commodus, would not endure the honest life to which Pertinax wished to reduce them, thus having given cause for hatred, to which hatred there was added contempt for his old age. He was overthrown at the very beginning of his administration. And here it should be noticed that the hatred is acquired as much as good works as by the bad ones. Therefore, as I said before, a prince wishing to keep his state is very often forced to do evil, for when the bad body is corrupt, whom you think you have need of to maintain yourself, it may be either the people or the soldiers or the nobles. You have to submit its humors and gratify them, and then the good works will do you harm. But let us come to Alexander, who was a man of such great goodness that among the other princes which accorded him in this, that in the 14 years he held the empire, no one ever put him to death by him unjudged. Nevertheless, being considered effeminate and a man who allowed himself to be governed by his mother, he became despised. The army conspired against him and murdered him. Turning now to the opposite characters of Commodus Severus and Antonius Caracalla and Maximinus, you will find them all cruel, rapacious men who satisfy their soldiers did not hesitate to commit. Turning now to the opposite characters of Commodus Severus, Antonius Caracalla, and Maximus, you will find them all cruel and rapacious men who, to satisfy their soldiers, did not hesitate to commit every kind of iniquity against the people, and all except Severus came to a bad end. But in Severus there was so much valor that, keeping the soldiers friendly, although the people were oppressed by him, he reigned successfully, for his valor made him so much admired in the sight of soldiers and the people that the latter were kept in a way astonished and awed, that the former respectful and satisfied. And because the actions of this man as a new prince were great, I wish to show briefly that he knew well how to counterfeit the fox and the lion, which natures, as I said above, it is necessary for a prince to imitate. Knowing the sloth of Emperor Julian, he persuaded the army in Scavelonia, for which he was captain, that it would be right to go Rome and avenge the death of Pertinax, who had been killed by Patronian soldiers under the pretext. Without appearing to aspire to the throne, he moved the army on Rome, and reached Italy before it was known that he had started. On his arrival at Rome, the Senate, through fear, elected him emperor and killed Julian. After this, there remained for Severus, who wished to make himself master of the whole empire, two difficulties. One, in Asia, where Niger, head of Asiatic army, had caused himself to be proclaimed emperor, and the other in the west, where Albinus was, who always aspired to be to the throne. And as he considered it dangerous to declare himself hostile to both, he decided to attack Niger and deceive Albinus. To the latter he wrote that, being elected emperor by the state, he was willing to share that dignity with him, and sent him the title of Caesar. And moreover, the Senate had made Albinus his colleague, which things were accepted by Albinus as true. But after Severus had conquered and killed Niger and settled Oriental affairs, he returned to Rome, complained to the Senate that Albinus, little recognizing the benefits that he had received from him, had by treachery sought to murder him, and for this ingratitude he was compelled to finish him. Afterwards he sought him out in France and took from him his government and life. He who will therefore carefully examine the actions of this man will find him the most valiant lion and the most cunning fox. He will find him feared and respected by everyone, and not hated by army. And it need not to be wondered that he, a new man, was able to hold the empire so well, because his supreme renown always protected him from the hatred from the people might be conceived against him for his violence. But his son, Antoninus, was most eminent man, had very excellent qualities which made him admirable in the sight of people, acceptable to the soldiers. He was warlike man, most enduring to fatigue, a despiser of all delicate food and other luxuries, which caused him to be beloved by the armies. Nevertheless, his ferocity and cruelties were so great and so unheard of. After endless single murders, he killed a large number of people of Rome and all those of Alexandria. He became hated by the whole world and also feared by those he had around him, to an extent that he was murdered in the midst of his army by a centurion. And here it must be noted that such like deaths, which are deliberately inflicted with a resolve and desperate courage, cannot be avoided by princes, because anyone who does not fear to die can inflict them. But a prince may fear them the less because they are very rare. He has only to be careful not to do any grave injury to those whom he employs or has around him to in the service of the state. Antoninus had not taken his care and had been killed a brother of that centurion, who also he daily threatened, yet retained his bodyguard, which, as it turned out, was a rash thing to do, obviously, and proved the emperor's ruin. But let us come to Commodius, whom it should have been very easy to hold empire. Being the son of Marcus, he had inherited it, and he had only to follow the footsteps of his father to please the people and soldiers. But being the nature of cruel and brutal, he gave them himself to be amusing the soldiers and corrupting them, so that he might indulge in rapacity upon the people. On the other hand, not maintaining his dignity after descending to the theatre to compete with gladiators, doing other wild things little worthy of the imperial majesty, he fell into contempt with the soldiers, and being hated by one party and despised by the other, he was conspired against and was killed. It remains to be discussed character of Maximus. He was very warlike man, the armies being disgusted with the efficacy of Alexander, of whom I have already spoken, killed him, elected Maximus to the throne. This he did not possess for long, for two things made him hated and despised. The one, he having kept sheep in Thrace, which brought him into contempt, and the other, his having to accession to his dominance, deferred going to Rome and taking possession of the imperial seat. He also gained a reputation of utmost ferocity by having, through his perfects in Rome and elsewhere in the empire, practiced many cruelties, so that the whole world was moved to anger at the meanness of his birth and fear of his barbarity. First Africa rebelled, then the Senate, the people of Rome, Italy conspired against him, and added to his own army. This latter besieged at Aquileia, and meeting with difficulties in taking it, were disgusted with his cruelties, fearing him less when they found so many against, and murdered him. I do not wish to discuss Gablios, Maricanus, or Julian, who, being thoroughly contemptible, were quickly wiped out. But I will bring this discourse to a conclusion by saying that princes in our times have this difficulty of giving inordinate satisfaction to their soldiers in a far less degree, because notwithstanding one has to give them some indulgence, that is soon done. None of these princes have armies that are veterans in governance and administration of provinces, as were the armies of the Roman Empire. And whereas it was then more necessary to give satisfaction to the soldiers than to the people, it is now more necessary to all princes except Turk and Soldan to satisfy people rather than the soldier, because the people are more powerful. From the above, I expected the Turk, who always keeps around his 12,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry, on which depend the security and strength of the kingdom, it is necessary that, putting aside every consideration for a people, he should keep them his friends. The kingdom of Soldan is similar, being entirely in the hands of soldier. It follows again that without regard of the people, he must keep them his friends. But you must know that the state of Soldan is unlike all other principalities, for the reason that it has Christian pontificate, which cannot be called either heredity or newly formed principality, because the son of old prince are not the heirs, but he who is elected to that position by those who have authority, the sons remains only noblemen. And this being an ancient custom, it cannot be called new principality, because there is none of those difficulties in the once met in the new one. For although the prince is new, the constitution of the state is old, and the frame to receive him as to were as heredity. By returning to the subject of our discourse, I say that whoever will consider it acknowledge that either hatred or contempt has been fatal to the above named emperors, it will be recognized also how it happened to that. A number of them acting in one way, a number another, only one in each way came to a happy end, and the rest to unhappy ones, because it would have been useless and dangerous for Pertinax and Alexander, being new princes, to imitate Marcus, who was heir to the principality, and likewise it would have been utterly destructive to Caracalla, Commodus, and Maximus to have imitated Severus, they have not having sufficient valor to enable them to tread in his footsteps. Therefore, a prince new to the principality cannot imitate the action of Marcus, nor again it is necessary to follow those of Severus, but he ought to take from Severus those parts which are necessary to found his state, and from Marcus those which are proper and glorious to keep a state that may already be stable and firm. Okay, so this was a really long chapter. I think I read it too fast as well. But yes, it has a lot of information, it has a lot of examples. Let's just give it a summary, right? A prince must above all avoid two things: being hated and being despised. We have discussed it over and over through the course of these chapters. Avoiding hatred: the surest way to become hated is to seize property or women of your subjects. Men will forgive the death of a family member, but they never forget the loss of their wealth. A prince should only resort to taking a life with proper justification, a clear cause, but he must never touch their property. Avoiding contempt, being despised. Now, a prince becomes conceited or despised when he is seen fickle, frivolous, effeminate, cowardly, and irresolute. Oh God. Avoiding being contempt or being despised, a prince becomes despised when he is seen fickle, frivolous, effeminate, cowardly, or irresolute. He must appear with greatness, courage, gravity, strength. Image of strength deters internal and external threats as people respect a leader who is decisive and powerful. Now, Machiavelli argues that the greatest defense against the conspiracy is goodwill of the people. A conspirator needs three things: a lot of luck, a strong motive, and a support of people. If the people are in your favor, a conspirator will be hesitant to act and fearing popular backlash. If people hate the prince, they will likely support the conspirator, making risk much lower. Therefore, keeping people content and not hated is the most powerful security measure. Right? Now, Machiavelli has given so many examples in this chapter which we can learn a lot of things, and he concluded that you need to, as he has mentioned before, you need to be a lion and a fox, both of it at the same time, and we need to take lessons from Marcus and Severus, but not all of it because it does not apply to each and every one, but the parts of it which will can be applied to your succession. Okay, moving on to chapter number 20. Are fortresses and many other things to which princes often resort advantageous or hurtful? This chapter is in points. So, point number 1. Some princes, so as to hold securely the state, have disarmed their subjects. Others have kept their subject towns distracted by factions. Others have fostered enmities against themselves. Others have laid themselves out to gain over those whom they distrusted in the beginning of their governments. Some have been built fortresses, some have overthrown and destroyed them, and although one cannot give a final judgment of all these things unless one possesses the particulars of those states in which a decision has to be made, nevertheless, I will speak as comprehensively as the matter of itself will admit. Second point, there never was a new prince who has disarmed his subject. Rather, when he has found them disarmed, he has always armed them, because by arming them, those arms becomes yours, and those men who are distrusted become faithful, and those who are faithful are kept so, and your subjects become your adherents. And whereas all subjects cannot be armed, yet when those whom you do arm are benefited, the others can be handed more freely. And this difference in their treatment, which they quite understand, makes the former your dependents, the latter considering it to be necessary that those who have the most danger in service should have been most reward, excuse you. But when you disarm them, you are at once offend them by showing that you distrust them, either for cowardice or for want of loyalty, and either of these opinions breed hatred against you. And because you cannot remain unarmed, it follows that you turn to mercenaries, which are of character already shown. Even if they should be good, they would not be sufficient to defend you against powerful enemies and distrusted subjects. Therefore, as I have said, a new prince in a new principality has always distributed arms. Histories are full of examples. But when a prince acquires a new state, which he adds as province to his old one, then it is necessary to disarm the men of that state, except those who have adherence in acquiring it. And these again, with time and opportunity, should be rendered soft and effeminate. And matters should be managed in such a way that all the armed men in the state shall be your own soldiers who in your old state are living near you. Point number 3. Our forefathers and those who were reckoned wise were accustomed to say that it was necessary to hold Pistoia by factions and Pisa by fortresses. And With this idea, they fostered quarrels in some of their tributary towns so as to keep possession of them the more easily. This may have been well known in those times when Italy was in way balanced, but I do not believe that it was accepted by a percept for today because I do not believe that factions can ever be used. Rather, it is certain that when the enemy comes upon divided cities, you are quickly lost, because the weakest party will always assist the outside forces and the others will not be able to resist. The Venetians moved, as I believe, by the absent reason fostered by Guelph and Ghibelline factions in their tributary cities. And although they never allowed them to come to bloodshed, yet they nursed these disputes amongst them, so that the people distracted by these differences should not unite against them, which, as we saw, did not afterwards turn out as expected because, after the rout of Vaila, one party at once took courage and seized the state. Such methods argue, therefore, weakness in the prince because these factions were never permitted in a vigorous principality. Such methods were enabling one the most easily to manage subjects are only useful in times of peace. But if war comes, this policy proves fallacious. Point number 4. Without doubt, princes become great when they overcome the difficulties and obstacles by which they are confronted, and therefore fortune, especially when she desires to make a new prince great who has greater necessity to earn renown than a hereditary one, causes enemies to arise and form designs against him in order that he may have opportunity of overcoming them and by them to mount higher as by the ladder which his enemies have raised. For this reason, many consider that a wise prince, when he has the opportunity, ought with craft to foster some animosity against himself, so that, having crushed it, his renown may rise higher. Point number 5. Princes, especially new ones, have found more fidelity and assistance in those men who, in the beginning of their rule, were distrusted, than among those who in the beginning were trusted. Pandolfo Petrosi, Prince of Siena, ruled his state more by those who had been distrusted than by others. But on this question, one cannot speak generally, for this varies so much that the individual. I will only say this, that those men who, at the commencement of the princedom, have been hostile, if they are of the description to need assistance to support themselves, can always be gained over the greatest ease, and they will be tightly held to serve the prince with fidelity, inasmuch as they know it is very necessary for them to cancel by deeds the bad impression which he had formed of them, and that the prince always extracts more profit from them than from those who serve him in too much security. Many neglect his affairs, and since the matter demands it, I must not fail to warn a prince who by means of secret favors have acquired a new state, that he must well consider the reason which induced those to favor him who did so. And if it is not natural affection towards him, but only discontent with their government, then he will only keep them friendly with great trouble and difficulty, for it will impossible to satisfy them. And weighing well the reasons for those examples which are taken from ancient and modern affairs, we shall find that it is easier for a prince to make friends of those men who were contented under the former government and are therefore enemies, than to those who, being discontented with it, were favorable to him and encouraged him to seize it. Point number 6. It has been a custom with princes, in order to hold their states more securely, to build fortresses that may serve as a bridle and bit to those who might design to work against them, and as a place of refuge from the first attack. I praise this system because it has been made of use formerly, notwithstanding that Messer Niccolo Vitelli in our times have been seen to demolish 2 fortresses in Città del Castello so that he might keep that state. Godo of the Valle, Duke of Urbino, on returning to his dominion, whence he had been driven to Caesar Borgia, raised to the foundation of all the fortresses in that province, and considered that without them it would be more difficult to lose it. The Bentivogli, returning to Bologna, came to a similar decision. Fortresses, therefore, are useful not according to circumstances. If they do you good in one way, they injure you in another. And this question can be reasoned thus. The prince who has more to fear from the people than from foreigners ought to build fortresses. But he who has more to fear from foreigners than from the people ought to leave them alone. The castle of Milan, built by Francesco Sforza, has made and will make more trouble for the house of Sforza than any other disorder in the state. For this reason, the best possible fortress is not to be hated by the people, because although you may hold the fortress, yet they will not save you if the people hate you. For they will never be wanting foreigners to assist a people who have taken arms against you. It has not been seen in our times that such fortresses have been of use to any prince, unless to the Countess of Forli, when the Count Girolamo, her consort, was killed. For by that means he was able to withstand the popular attack and wait for assistance from Milan, and thus recover her state. The posture of affairs was such at that time that the foreigners could not assist the people. But fortresses were of little value to her afterwards, when Caesar Borgia attacked her, and when the people, her enemy, were allied with foreigners. Therefore, it would have been safer for her, both then and before, not to have been hated by the people than to have had the fortress. All these things considered, then I shall praise him who builds fortresses as well as him who does not, and I shall blame whoever, trusting in them, cares little about being hated by the people. So, chapter number 20 was really short, and it mainly focused on whether you should build fortresses, whether they help you win wars or not. Well, Machiavelli, I think, was very conflicted, because one hand he gave examples of how fortresses saved someone, and the other hand he said that they really do not mean anything. But I think Machiavelli's whole point was that you should not be hated by your people, and he has been saying this for last I don't know how many chapters, and I think it has some credit to it, because yes, it is easier to rule people when they really like you or they fear you, but not hate you, right? That was it for today. I will see you next week with the next chapters, and until then, keep reading and keep watching.